The atmosphere at Lord's crackled with anticipation as the sun bathed the field in a warm golden glow. The year was 1878, and a clash between the Australians and Middlesex was about to ignite the passions of cricket fans across London. But as the game started, something or someone lurked in the shadows. And that is because across the sprawling city of London, another game of monumental proportions was also about to start. Surrey, the big name host, would face off against Gloucestershire, a team boasting the legendary W.G. Grace. At that point, Grace was a bigger draw than Australia. He was a bigger thing than cricket. But despite the fact that Australia were playing Middlesex and Grace was up against Surrey, the real clash would actually be between Grace and the Australians. And the reason was that both camps had laid claim to Billy Midwinter, a very highly talented player who'd been born in Gloucestershire but had already played test matches for the Aussies. He was torn between the two, but that morning he was with Australia and was at Lord's ready to play against Middlesex. This is something that W.G. Grace only found out about when he realised he was one man short at the Oval. He could have found a substitute for his team, but he did something far more full on. Determined to salvage the situation, Grace, accompanied by his brother E.M. and the imposing Arthur Bush, a wicketkeeper and rugby bruiser, they embarked on a frantic journey to Lord's in a carriage, leaving behind a makeshift group of substitute fielders in their place. Upon arrival at the home of cricket, the man bigger than the game himself stormed into the visiting changing rooms like he owned the place, because I suppose in some ways he did, and his eyes were fixed on Billy Midwinter. What happened next is known as the kidnapping of Billy Midwinter, though the term kidnapping may be exaggerating the situation a little bit. Midwinter was already torn between his commitment to Gloucestershire and the allure of representing his country, and he found himself caught in a web of conflicting emotions. But duty prevailed and Grace persisted, so Midwinter travelled with him to the Oval in a carriage. But while this was happening, the Australian captain, Dave Gregory, who had already tried to stop Grace at Lord's, he got his own posse together and he found his own carriage so they could, I assume, follow that cab across town. So now both groups are going from North London back to South London together, and you can imagine both are getting more and more angry on this trip. Well, when the carriages arrived, it was more like a Western shootout than an all-in brawl. There was a lot of name-calling and getting in each other's faces, and what E.M. Grace described as unparliamentary language. Luckily, no punches were thrown, but Grace won, as he often did when it came to cricket, and so Midwinter batted for Gloucestershire, where he made 4 runs in the game. 4 in one innings and a duck in the other, although he did pick up a couple of wickets. Perhaps the biggest anticlimax in the history of cricket. But this story suggests that there was always a time when players picked team over country. And it's true. But the rub in all this was that Midwinter would have made a lot more playing for the Australians than Gloucestershire. That is why he picked his national team. Well, not quite his national team. As I said, he was born in Gloucestershire. In fact, in his career, Midwinter would play tests for Australia, and then for England, and then finally for Australia again. Why do I mention all this? Because a couple of things have happened recently that kind of reminded me of this story. Jofra Archer allegedly getting offered a contract where the Mumbai Indians want him to ask for permission when he has to play for England. That might sound new, and a lot of people have reacted to it that way. But not only have other franchises said similar things, though often far more informally, cricketers through history of the game have had to ask permission or actually just choose who they want to play with. And they haven't always chosen their nation. In fact, right now there's a similar thing happening that no one seems all that concerned with. Scotland and the Netherlands are playing in the ICC qualifiers for the World Cup. They both have very good teams and would have a chance of qualifying, except for the fact that many of their best players are not available. Look at this list of Dutch players not in their squad. That's a hell of a bowling attack. In fact, South Africa may say it is the hell of a bowling attack. They're also not going to have their best all-rounder and probably their most talented batter. At the same time, Scotland's team is also heavily depleted, which means that both of these sides are now far less likely to make it to the event that changes their future, fortunes and financials. And it's not so much that the counties are forcing the players to do this, it's just that the players will make more money playing for their county than they will for their national team. In some places, they don't want to lose their spot as well. And yet the same people who seem very upset with the Jofra Archer situation don't seem as concerned with the fact that county cricket is taking players away from their countries because they are paying them more than their national team. although it's a near identical situation. And I think we tend to think that money is something new and crazy that never happened before in cricket. That's just not true. And if you think the Jofra Archer, Netherlands and Scotland situation is something new, here's a story about Glenn Turner, who was probably the greatest long-term batter that New Zealand had ever had. But unfortunately, he was also one of the best players that Worcestershire had as well. So in his 14-year test career, he played only 41 matches, and he didn't play at all for a 6-year period for New Zealand. Now, there was a lot going on with Turner and New Zealand, but when you listen deep and you go beyond all the other issues that he had with New Zealand cricket, what he kept talking about again and again was professionalism. When he played for Worcestershire, he was a professional cricketer. When he played for New Zealand, he was an amateur. And so a team that had finally got it to act together and was entering their first great test period did it without the best opening batter they had ever produced. But I don't need to go back that far. What about all the Kolpak players in county cricket? The Slovak handball player changed international cricket more than players who've had 15 and 20-year careers have. And look at this list. A lot of people think it's just about South Africans. You can see there are Kiwis, West Indians and Zimbabweans who play professionally in England over their nations for financial reasons. County teams in England had no problems at all taking all that talent for their local competitions. And while many of those players were on the fringe of their national teams, that still has an impact on the overall strength of the competition. But you can also see one of the most recent players was Blessing Muzarabani. Sometimes it was really good players. And of course it wasn't just Kolpak rulings. There were many different players who used a lot of weird visa regulations to come and play cricket for England over being available for their national team. And county cricket was happy to take any of these overseas players and weaken national teams without a moment's thought, as long as it got them 4 wickets on a flat pitch at Beckenham. However, it's also not just about county cricket. Garfield Sobers had to be convinced by Don Bradman and Richie Benaud to represent the West Indies over playing Lancashire League cricket. And it's not even just the non-England players. Sydney Barnes was the best bowler of the first half of the game's history, and he would often refuse to play county cricket because he was getting paid more in the leagues. England didn't get to use one of their best players ever because he was getting more money to play for a club than he was for a county or the national team. And of course, I could go on and on about Kerry Packer and the ICL, not to mention that South Africa broke their ban by reaching into their checkbooks. Players have decided again and again to pay their mortgage with the skills that they have rather than just representing their national team. In fact, outside the Billy Midwinter story, there are 2 other crazy stories from the first part of cricket. Stewie Dempster averaged over 50 in tests. Aubrey Faulkner is the only player with a sub-30 bowling average and a 40-plus batting average over a decent amount of runs and wickets. Dempster was from New Zealand and Faulkner was from South Africa. But both chose to play for a private team in England with a man called Julian Khan. It was not even a club side, but mostly just games in Khan's massive estate. And if you want to know how serious these matches were, Khan would bat with blow-up pads because he was afraid of the ball, and umpires would count leg byes as his runs because he paid their bills. These are 2 greats of their nation playing backyard cricket for a rich dude who wanted to play with legends. Again, if you go back to the writing of the era, there aren't that many articles about how Julian Khan was weakening the New Zealand or the South African team. And it's just true that cricket has a funny relationship with money, and a lot of that is driven by the amateur-professional divide. And the truth is that much of the amateur cricket was utter nonsense anyway. W.G. Grace got paid more than any professional, as he should, but then he would look down on the professionals while doing so. That takes a special kind of dick. And even before Grace, money was what ran cricket. And it didn't just start when the Oval put up gates. When Hambledon was the centre of our game, it wasn't because it was some mystical cricket zone, but because people gambled like hell there. And that is why they wrote the laws down to stop the arguments over bets. Michael Holding once told me, players will go where the money is. That was true of Hambledon in the late 1700s, and that is true today. And of course they will. They spend their peak years killing their bodies for other people's entertainment. Of course they're going to try and make as much money in that earning period that they're probably never going to match again. They may love one format over another, or one coach over another, or want to play for their nation more than a franchise. But when it comes down to it, mortgage providers don't accept test caps as a valid form of deposit. And looking back at the history of the game, they never have. What is happening to Jofra Archer and the Dutch and the Scottish teams is not new. It wasn't T20 cricket that did this. It has been happening for hundreds of years. T20 cricket is not kidnapping players. The cricketers are just making their own decisions. The only thing different now is it's happening quicker and more often, which is a little bit like T20 cricket in a nutshell.